Hi, and welcome to this talk on installing the rock-solid knowledge SAML component as a service provider on OpenIddict. So OpenIddict is an open source framework that's used to add both OIDC client and server support to your applications. And rock-solid knowledge provides a component to add SAML support to OpenIddict. Now this talk comes in two parts. We'll implement an identity provider and we'll implement a service provider. And we'll do both of these on OpenIddict, and we'll do both of these using the SAML components from rock-solid knowledge. The identity provider provides the identity infrastructure. So it's the identity provider that provides the ability to do things like authenticating a user. The service provider is the service your user wants to use. And this is typically a web application. And we can't have one without the other. So in the second part of this talk, we'll implement the IDP. But in this part of the talk, we'll implement the service provider. Now, a service provider can't work without an identity provider. So in this talk, we'll use the identity provider that we'll implement a little later. So for the service provider, we'll implement a web application, and we'll integrate the service provider into that application. For the identity provider, we are going to use OpenIddict, and as I said, we'll implement that in the second part of this talk. Now, the identity provider doesn't have to be OpenIddict. It could be Identity Server, or it could be Okta, or it could be one of any number of SAML identity providers. So let's start. Let's see how we implement the service provider on OpenIddict. So this is the project for the application loaded inside Rider. So let me just run this. And this is a standard ASP.NET Core application built from the template. And notice on the navigation bar here, I have an entry called Details. And this wants to take me to the Details page. And that Details page wants to show details about the logged on user, such as that user's claims. So the application has a controller, and that controller has an action, which is details. But notice this action has the authorize attribute associated with it. So when I try and access that details page, I must be authenticated. So the application must authorize me. The page itself looks like this. So it's quite simple. It takes the user from the context, gets the claims for that user, and just prints out those claims. So if I go back to the application and try and use this now, then we get an error. And the error we get is telling us that this account login page can't be found. So it's trying to authenticate the user in some way, and it can't do that yet. So let's do that by adding SP support into this application. So back in the project, let me close the open code. So to add SP support, I first need to do a couple of things. I need to add the rock-solid knowledge NuGet package, and then I need to get a license key to use that package. So if I go to NuGet, and in here do a search for RSK.SAML.OpenIddict, and we'll find a reference to the RSK.SAML.OpenIddict NuGet package. And notice that we're currently on version 8 of this package. And I can go and add a reference to this package into the project. So let me do that and install this. So before I can use this, I need to get a license. To get a license, go to OpenIddictComponents.com and then enter my first name, last name, and my email address. And then rock-solid knowledge will email me a license. Now, I've already done this, and I've added that license information into my appsettings.development file. The licensee you get back will always be called demo, and the license key will look something like this. And I need to use both of these inside my code. So let's set that up first of all. So if I go into program.cs, in here, I'm going to add a couple of variables, and I'm going to grab that license key from the configuration file. So I want the licensee, which will be builder.configuration, and then using the licensee key. And then I want the license key itself. And the key for that is simply license key. So once I have that, I can now configure my authentication. And there's a few things we need to do for this. So notice at the moment, when I configure the services, I add authentication, And into this, I add a default scheme, and that's called cookie, and I add that cookie. I also need to tell authentication what the default challenge scheme is going to be. And we give this default challenge scheme a name that we'll use later on. So let's call this SAML-OpenIddict. Once I have that set up, I can then add SAML support. And to do that, I call add SAML2P. And notice this comes from the rock-solid knowledge SAML2P component that was added when we added the OpenIddict support. So I add this call. Into here, I need to specify the name of the authentication scheme. And in this case, that's going to match the default challenge scheme that we set above. So that will be SAML-OpenIddict. And then we configure this with some options. So into the options, I need to specify a couple of things. I need to specify my license key, and that's the license key we've set above. And I need to specify the licensee. And again, that's the licensee that we specified above. I then need to configure the SAML service provider. And for that, I need to add a few things. So my SAML service provider will talk to my SAML identity provider, and they'll do some time comparisons. And the times on the servers might not match exactly. So we can specify a time comparison tolerance. So we can say options.time comparison tolerance. And let's just set this to 10 seconds. We also need to know which server to talk to. So to do that, we set the identity provider metadata address. And this is going to be the address on our identity provider from which we can get the metadata to configure our SAML communication. Our IDP will be running on port 5003, and its metadata address will be /SAML/metadata. We then have to specify a callback path. So we do options.callback path, and this is the address in this service provider that the IDP will call back into as part of the SAML communication. And this callback path is /signin followed by the default challenge scheme. So that's -SAML-OpenIddict. After that, we provide what's known as the service provider options. So I say options.serviceproviderOptions, and this is an object. So we create a new SP options, and then into here, we specify options for this service provider. So we set what's known as the entity ID, which you can think of as the name of this service provider. And that's used when we configure the IDP, as we'll see in the other talk. So we give this a unique name. So we choose the host address, which is localhost 5001/SAML. We also have to specify the metadata path for this service provider. And that's the same as the default challenge scheme. So that's /SAML-OpenIddict. And then finally, we're going to sign these messages. To sign the messages, I need to use a certificate. So we set signing certificate. We give it a new X509 certificate. To this certificate, we pass the location of the certificate, which for this demonstration is in resources /test client.pfx. This certificate has a password, and the password is just test. So my IDP is running. So I just need to run this service provider. We hit the home page, which I'm now running in an incognito window, so we don't get any confusion with cookies we said previously. Notice that we are running on port 5001. If I click on the details link, that needs authentication. We've now configured SAML as the authentication, and it takes me off to my IDP. And notice that the URL has changed, and we've now hit a server that's running on port 5003. I've set up a test user for this, whose email address is bob@test.fake. And the password for this is password123!, and that password has a capital P. So if I click on Login, we get redirected back to our details page. We are now authenticated. And on this page, we're now listing the claims for this user. So we've used the SAML component to add SAML support into our service provider. So I hope you found this useful. So the code for the service provider and for the identity provider are on GitHub, and they're at this URL.